morning, everyone, and welcome to the CBI at 10. Someone said to me, I think 6 months ago, but it might have been the week before last, that there's no sense of time in this pandemic, that there's only today, yesterday, and tomorrow. And yet here we are on March the 15th and suddenly realizing it's been a year. And so the aim of this morning's conversation is just to try and take stock on what's learned, what's been a temporary change, what's been a hiatus in our normal lives, and what possibly is transformed for good. And so we're joined by Matthew Fell, the Policy Director of the CBI. Matthew, good to see you again. Ray Newton-Smith, the CBI's Chief Economist, hopefully is going to point us to a few sunlit uplands in the not too distant future, and Jenny Beckwith, who's the Head of Employment Policy. Jenny, brilliant of you to join us, not least because the thing that we've probably thought about and reconsidered more radically than anything else is the way in which the jobs market can work and employment policy can work. Before we get into some of that stock taking, Matthew, and I think it'd be really useful for everyone on the call, please weigh in with the things that you think have changed, you think have worked, and that we can feed that in. You know, we've been doing these calls for a year now, and part of them has been having that perspective, but part of that has been just being in the day-to-day. And I wonder, before we get into taking a longer look, whether you can just give us a run through of what's on the to-do list for the CBI this week.
Brilliant. Well, thanks, James. Very happy to do that, and good morning, everybody. As ever, as you say, James, plenty of live stuff to get stuck into this week. I think a few bits on my mind. Firstly, on Friday, just gone actually, we put in our views to the government on the update of the safer working guidance. This is what firms have been using to sort of work out how they get their workplaces in good shape. It's really good, actually. It was part of, James, you'll recall, the CBI's roadmap call to say, let's refresh this. So terrific that the government have listened and acted on that. And I think the views are, you know, look, this is something that's been broadly working pretty well. We liked the idea of that flexibility within a framework, for example. But I think a few bits just to freshen that up. One is just to say, could it be really clear on the legal status of the document? Could it just be updated to take into account the interplay? We've got more tools at our disposal between workplace testing, the vaccines, as well as some of the PPE measures and so on. And also a push as much as possible, could we get that consistency in, which we've been calling for throughout this pandemic, right across the UK, particularly with the devolved nations. If it could work in lockstep, that'd be great. So that's the safer working guidance. A couple of other bits. I think we're still firmly on the case with testing and workplace testing. We heard over the weekend there's actually now 48,000 businesses registered to do workplace testing, and that's shot up. You know, it was only a couple of weeks ago we were talking about that being in the hundreds of businesses actually. So terrific progress there. A reminder to all businesses on the call, if you want to be part of this and take advantage of the government's offer, you have to register by the end of March. So please do that. There's only a couple of weeks to go now, but good that we've got that uptake going on. And then the third bit is around international travel. There is a global travel task force up and running as part of the government's roadmap reviews. We've been in good contact with the Department for Transport and others around roundtables they're setting up. We've got CBI members involved, CBI ourselves are involved, all with an eye to getting in views ahead of a report that's going to the Prime Minister by the 12th of April, ahead of a potential 17th of May reopening as per the roadmap. So that is what we're pushing to, working on issues such as consumer confidence, logistics, international coordination, and so on. And then, James, just to finish on this opening bit, a few things that are still to come. So those things are live right now. We're also working on the background, I think, two other major reviews as part of the government roadmap. One around certificates, either vaccine or testing certification, and also the social distancing review, which is perhaps the single most important thing of this entire roadmap. We know that both of those are going to conclude by June. There was a few questions coming in on the chat last week and as part of our regional trawl and so on. So that's what people should be planning towards. And we're feeding into both of those. So if you have views on those, let us know. On certificates, I think people are reasonably cautious about those, conscious that they could be a bit of a sort of reputational and employee relations minefield. But those that are entertaining the thought, thinking very much about, is this a way of giving staff additional confidence about coming back and also resilience around staying open? And then on that social distancing review, It's clearly not our bag to be sort of shaping the health debate around that, but what we have done very usefully previously on this is just help government understand what are the ramifications from a business point of view if you go from 2 meters to 1 meter to 0 meters in different workplace settings. So if you're a restaurant, what does it do for the number of covers that you can have in a manufacturing plant line? What's the productive capacity you can operate to, and how efficient are you going to be? So we're going to be refreshing all of that and getting that into the Cabinet Office ahead of that June review.
Right. Matthew, I'm sure we'll come to a few of the other things, because there are a few pieces, you know, when Rain and I were last on the call, we were talking about tax day, and there's some questions I know that are in people's sights on that. And actually, I imagine that there are a couple of other things which we'll come to in the course of the call, not least around some of the employment issues, which we can pick up with Jenny. But do you want to sort of have a first go at what we've set ourselves as the task for today, which is just to try and give ourselves a sense of genuinely what we've learned, what's meaningful in this?
Yeah, well, thanks, James. I mean, I guess the first bit of reflection is sort of what we've tried to do as a CBI, as our organisation through this pandemic. And for me, there are bits around, one, just making sure that everybody on the call throughout has the right information and the latest stuff. I mean, the first thing is there's just been so much to digest over this year, and it's been rapidly moving. So making sure we get that information out there. Then I think on the influencing piece, the bits that I've thought we've been focused on, one is something around the magnitude of the interventions that we've had over the last year. And Jenny, you'll sort of grin at this. I remember almost the very first thing we were doing when this sort of kicked off a year ago was thinking about sick leave issues and things like that. And how rapidly we went from that to talking about government subsidising 80% of people's wages through the furlough scheme. So there's a magnitude and a scale point here. I think, James, there's also something around practicalities, and I think one of the things that we're most proud about is the way that we were able to play a small part in helping, but then businesses stepping up with things like the PPE and the ventilator challenges and so on. So that idea of business in the service of the nation and so on. And then the other bit, I think, was around the cliff edges and the coverage gaps, and that's something that we worked at all the way through this. We plugged away at. I think the cliff edges, again, it really stuck with me. Some of those moments when we were at 5 to midnight almost on the extension of the furlough scheme and people about to trigger redundancy consultations and so on. We worked brilliantly and collaboratively with organisations like the TUC on those issues where we had common cause, and the coverage gaps around some of those sort of missing middle on the loan schemes and things like that. So those were the bits that I think we were really have stuck in my mind. And the learnings when you step back from all of that, which maybe tees us up for this conversation. One, I think, is just the power of collaboration, how much that has been an issue throughout. And I actually believe, James, this has really almost changed the way that business and government work together. The idea that actually it's okay to be agile and you can iterate and refine things as we go, but to get that in from the off sort of thing as a collaborative working. The second would be much for businesses actually, is the rate of innovation that is possible with that agile working. I lost count back in the spring and summer of just how many firms said to me, look, we've changed in a matter of weeks what previously would have taken us 5 years to implement and so on. So I think that innovation and the rate of innovation, thinking about how people like Pfizer and AstraZeneca managed to get the vaccine developed and approved in such a short pace of time. And we heard brilliantly from the likes of Ben Osborne about how they've done that working with the regulator with sort of twin tracking it and so on. And then the final bit for me as a reflection, James, would be the commitment to build back better. This idea that we're now building back around an economic vision. And again, unprompted, I find the number of companies when you don't mention this, they bring you up on it and say, actually, let's not lose sight of this issue, the commitment to some of the green issues, the work-life balance, the focus on mental health, all of those kind of issues, I think are now pretty hardwired in to business thinking. And of course they were there pre-pandemic, but just not at the level of intensity I feel that now exists. And I think people are really serious about doing the next 10 years better than the previous 10 years on all of those and many other issues. So they'd be some of my learnings to get us underway, James.
Well, Matthew, thank you. It's so interesting, isn't it, thinking about how what it's been like trying to communicate exactly as you say, both the listening that we're trying to do in this exercise and also the sharing of information when there's so much of it and it's so essential and complicated. I'm definitely alive to the fact that people are already looking forward. As you were speaking, Matthew, Deb Oxley was asking this question about what does the autumn look like, which subject we've raised on this call before. And I'm going to, just to let Deb know, we're definitely going to come to that, sort of a bit of forward looking. But I'm going to just turn to Jenny, if I might. Jenny, I am really confused by how permanent and profound the changes in employment policy will be. Right? So some of them around the scale of the government stepping in around furlough. How does that change our thinking about state support for people in work and how permanent that will be? But then other areas that we found we were talking about so much on these calls in this last year, statutory sick pay, holiday pay, and the way in which that's overseen and implemented. And I just wondered, from a very strict sort of employment policy point of view, what do you think happened in this last year and how much will last?
Yeah, thank you. I think there's probably two ways of answering that. I think the first way is definitely the changes that individual businesses have seen. And then, as you say, the changes that we've seen from the government and the macro interventions. I think on the first side and the way that businesses have changed, the first thing is definitely the overnight change that Matthew was talking about with regards to businesses changing their operations, whether that's businesses that have moved to working from home full time, or whether that's businesses moving to having to implement changes to their health and safety approaches and thinking about flexibility around sort of staggered shifts as a means to improve health and safety. That has changed fundamentally. Now, obviously, the importance of health and well-being is not new. It is long been known, but bringing that to the forefront has been the big change. And I think that yes, that is something that is going to continue. Not least because one of the main changes through this pandemic, it's actually I think been a really humanizing aspect of how employees engage with their employees, is the recognition that mental health, as well as protecting people from COVID, mental health has been the thing that every single employer has had to deal with. Every employer has dealt with the challenges around employees and homeschooling, or around the challenges of isolation, or around the challenges of supporting individuals where they've sadly lost loved ones. You know, that's been a really humanizing aspect of the pandemic, which I think is set to continue. And probably how that works for individual businesses. One is the priority on mental health, definitely, but the other, I think, is changing how leaders and managers engage with their staff. So it's not just about putting in place mental health support, signposting to support more regular check-ins. It is also fundamentally about changing how leaders and managers engage with their staff. And we know that, these are stats from pre-pandemic, but we know that employers that have the highest level of employee engagement also have 20% higher profits than businesses with the lowest level of employee engagement. And I think that the relevance of that, it absolutely comes to the fore when we're talking about business situations where actually employee engagement means a whole lot more when you've got half of your workforce at home and you've got half of the workforce coming into the office at different times. That leadership and management change is going to be a really big fundamental shift.
Can I just ask you one thing about that, Jenny, which is when we had a call about this a week ago, one person on the call asked Tony Danker, what he thought the outlook was going to be in terms of the way we worked and this issue of hybrid working. Some people in the office, some not, and I appreciate not everyone works in offices, but for that kind of office-based community. And Tony's point was, look, we just don't know. There's going to be a lot of experimentation and we're going to learn a lot from each other. Do you already begin to see any effort at organizing that information so that those of us who are interested to know what different businesses are doing can learn what's working and what's not? And you begin to pull together any examples of how that's working?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, of course, it is the million-dollar question. And Tony's right by saying that every business will need to make a decision for themselves about what is the purpose of their shared workplace. And once I think employers, I mean, they are starting to have that conversation now, not least because we shouldn't forget that, you know, for many people on this call, they're looking at the roadmap and they're also thinking about what, you know, not only reopening, but what changes their workplace might need to go through in order to be fully up and running over the summer. I think a few things that will really inform employers' approach. One is the changing expectations of employees. You know, this has been an overnight change in terms of operations, but it's also been an overnight change in terms of employees' expectations and what they want from their employer. So I think, you know, you were speaking about office-based working. 90%, more than 90% of people who work in offices say that they want to work from home all of the time, or at least some of the time. So that's, you know, a big shift. And employers are recognizing that. I think what it means practically, as I said at the beginning, it's thinking about what is the shared workplace for. And for every single business, that will be different, depending on whether they've got they've primarily got a younger workforce where it's more about training and collaboration, and that's, you know, important for its usage. Or you have creative businesses where collaboration and creativity and innovation is more the purpose of the shared workplace. So it's a question that individual businesses will have to answer. But the key reason and why it's important is the shift to hybrid working is only going to be sustainable if that balance between flexibility for the employee and for the employer works for both parties. And that, I think, is the essence of why it has to be an employer-led decision. And the second part of your question asked about peer learning and resources. Absolutely, I think particularly around some of the operational challenges or the operational changes, so things like office equipment, things like changing meeting rooms, you know, from hot desking, changing meeting rooms, all of that sort of setup, to some of the mental health and leadership and management support that employers put in place. It will all be based on peer learning, and the CBI came out last week with some guidance, which we really hope is helpful for employers to think about the questions that they might want to ask themselves for their workplace to get that shift, that shift to be sustainable and get that flexibility balance that I was talking about right for their firm.
It's so interesting, isn't it, Jenny? If you think about it, you know, a couple of years ago, or probably not even a couple of years ago, for the last decade or so, there's been a discussion about what you wear on a Friday. We've moved to a completely different level of conversation about working plans and cultures. I'm going to come back to you in a moment, if I might, but Rain, I want to talk a little about the politics of all of this, but let's start with the economics. Firstly, will you give us a sense of what your read is on the shape of the coronavirus shock to the economy, and then what you think the likely shape is of the coming recovery?
Yeah, so I mean, and James, this conversation definitely takes me back to some of the conversations we had in the spring last year, and I remember then, you know, there was this big debate: is it going to be a V-shaped recovery? And then I talked about this sort of Nike swoosh, and I think which is a bit of a I'm never sure if trying to reduce the whole economy to a symbol really makes sense, because what we know is there's a huge complexity there.
By the way, I'm sure it doesn't make sense amongst fellow economists, but for the rest of us, it's massively helpful.
But I guess what that was trying to articulate, and I think it is what we'll have seen, is that we saw this big trough in growth, this sharp drop. But I think the idea that we're just going to spring like an elastic band back to sort of where we were isn't right? We will, I think, if we look, and I'll come back to this, if we look at the OBR forecast, even over a quite significant medium term, we'll probably see some long-term scarring effects. We're definitely seeing some structural shifts in the economy which have been accelerated by this crisis. But I think where it does have some elements of that V-shapedness is, we saw the economy shrink by, almost 25% in Q2, and actually it last year. Now it may be that when we read the stats further down the line, it won't have been quite as severe as that, but we do know it will be one of the sharpest drops in output that we've seen since 1701, so just really off the scale. And then we did see a recovery over the summer, but what we do know is this pandemic is now with us for longer. And so, if we look to what will happen to our growth in the first quarter of this year, it's likely to have shrunk by around 4%. But thereafter, we should see growth. And now the big question, the big sort of policy dilemma is, are we about to see a return of the roaring 20s? Are we going to see, once restrictions are lifted, will we see demand pick up extremely quickly? Might we even see problems of inflation? And my sense is, if we look at the economy as a whole, the OBR expect to see growth of around 4% this year, and that feels about right, somewhere between 4 and 5% this year, and maybe growth of 7% next year. And I think actually one of the things that is maybe most comforting about what we thought we might see back in the spring or in the summer last year is what's happening to unemployment. And in a way, it really reflects how some of the government policies and some of the things that Jenny and Matthew and I can remember working into the night, so many conversations about designing that job retention scheme. It really is working to do the job of flattening that curve of unemployment, because we might see unemployment peak at about 6.5%. It might only get to about 6%. And of course, if you've lost your job, that's not a great comfort. But I think unemployment could have gone much higher. So I think we've seen the policies have really worked. But I think the other thing we all have to bear in mind is we're not, and this really comes home, through what we've seen through this pandemic, is we're not all in this together in terms of who bears the economic costs of this. And we know that what we've seen actually is that households sort of above medium earnings have tended to increase their savings over this time period. And so when people talk about that roaring 20s, it's really that sort of top half of the income distribution who have saved on travel where they've been able to work from home, who haven't been out spending, in shops, in cafes, in restaurants, in travel, both domestically and internationally. But those on the bottom 20% of incomes are much more likely to have lost their jobs and have had to actually dip into their savings. So this idea that household savings as a whole has gone up by, till now averaging 25%, which is very high by historical standards. It isn't an equal distribution of that. And we know, whether we're talking about gender or race, or where people are in the income distributions, we haven't all shared in this equally. So that's why I think kind of minimizing some of the scarring effects of this crisis is really important. And I'm sure we'll come on to talk about it, but that's sort of what will stick from this. It is definitely that move to shopping online. That's accelerated a trend. The change in hybrid working we've talked about already, and just adopting digital technologies. It definitely has accelerated the adoption of digital technologies pretty much across the spectrum. So I think that's something that will stay with us, but I think the scarring isn't equally felt, and that will be a challenge for us as a society.
Yeah, and Rain, I want to come to that in one moment. Can I just pick up on one thing? I completely appreciate your point about unemployment. I think that if we went back to the conversations we were having, certainly in the spring, summer of last year, it was around a fear of unemployment reaching closer to 10, people talking about 11%. And that is a dog that hasn't barked, and it's clearly the case. Sparing your blushes, but that actually the work the CBI and the TUC did with the Treasury furlough, you can point your finger and say that made a massive difference to unemployment. So some things that we thought would happen haven't happened. The number that you give around a 4% rebound this year is, if you like, the mirror image of that, because we were also talking, I think, last year around a very, very sharp contraction in the economy in 2020. But as the vaccination rollout happened, when it happened, those pent-up household savings and that pent-up demand would lead to a real spring back. So for people who probably like me are like, really, 4%? That's less than we thought. Can you explain why it's at around that number?
So there's a few things about it. First of all, what happens in the first quarter of the year actually has a big impact on the sort of annual growth figure. So we've got to remember, we're still, you know, when we mid-March, we're still very much in a lockdown, right? You walk on the streets, there's very little in England at the moment that is opening. We know in Wales you could now get your hair cut, but you know, and we know actually those restrictions will continue into the second quarter. And then there's a separate question about how, you know, I think, you know, and I know there's been a question already on this. Look, I personally don't think in the second half of this year and in the winter that we will see no restrictions at all on our behavior. I think there will need to be some restrictions, you know, in terms of social distancing. Now, hopefully we'll be able to have, you know, the vast majority of the economy up and running as normal, but I think there will still be some restrictions. So it's partly just reflecting the fact that you're still seeing at least half of the year where we've got pretty substantial restrictions on the economy. So therefore you're relying on growth in the second half of the year to really drive the majority of that 4% growth. So that's part of it. And then there is a question mark as to, you know, once you know, people are vaccinated, the restrictions are lifted, how comfortable will people feel about being out and about spending? My personal view is I think people, once you've had the vaccine yourself and those, you know, around you have, and you feel that most people, you know, are safe from the virus, I think people will very quickly adopt some, you know, be very keen to do some of that spending we haven't seen already. And that's why I think there is a lot of uncertainty around growth. And the OBR's forecast at around 4% is probably towards the slightly more pessimistic end of the spectrum. I think the Bank of England thinks some of that household spending will come back quicker.
Right.
But I think that's, you know, the sort of range of what we're seeing at the moment.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. I'm going to come back, and Matthew, I'm going to play you in a moment on this question about the fourth quarter and planning for, you know, the possibility of future social distancing. But Jenny, would you just pick up on the point about an unequal recovery, a very unequal experience in terms of savings and spending over the course of the year, and the sort of extent to which this has, on the one hand, exposed and reminded us of big structural inequalities, right, which obviously play in employment. But I'm interested too in the politics of this as regards support for business. And I'm wondering the extent to which you think that, you know, support for business, whether it's through business interruption loan schemes, whether it's through furlough, is going to change the politics around business in the next few years. I mean, I suppose you've seen a hint of that in the structure of the Chancellor's budget at the beginning of the month. But I wonder how much you think the combination of these inequality issues in terms of the demand side on government and the financial support side, the supply in terms of support, changes the politics around business.
I think so probably the clearest place that we've seen inequality when it comes to unemployment has been youth unemployment. You know, overall, as Rain said, despite the fact that the CJRS has clearly worked, and we are talking about an unemployment rate at the moment of just over 5%, for under 24s, it is significantly higher. So that's, I think, a good example of where there has clearly been inequality in the impact on businesses and then what it means for young people. In terms of where I think that it, you know, what it means for in terms of government policy, I think it's a couple of things. First, it's clear that their focus on job creation is very much in job creation to support young people and job creation in the green economy to support the country's wider ambitions towards net zero. So that is definitely part of the policy landscape. I think the other thing that it's worth thinking about is when we're in maybe putting in some perspective from pre-pandemic is helpful. when we're in situations of relatively low unemployment, and I'm talking now about unemployment more generally, not just for young people, the focus for the government's policy has been around good work. So not just about the numbers of people going into work, but about job quality. And certainly, I think if we are to make Build Back Better meaningful on employment, we have to not just think about job creation in terms of numbers. We also have to think about the quality of people's work, and that is primarily about how they are led, how they are engaged, how they are managed to give their best at work, being core and part of a cornerstone really to the response, both the government response, but also the response that we see in individual businesses. So I think the inequality is mainly around age for job creation, but on numbers overall, the job quality aspect to the debate, which was really prominent in 2017 to 2019, hasn't gone away and will shape the government's response to this going forward.
That's really interesting, and also really welcome reminder at this stage, because it's somewhat difficult to see. Ray, can I just also put you on the spot for a moment about that second element of this, which is, if you remember in the spring of last year, particularly when the furlough was rolled out, there was quite a lot of anxiety amongst business and around the CBILS too, was if we business take the government's money, are we going to pay for it either reputationally or in tax and other forms of financing in the months and years to come? And I wonder what you reflect on that now, how the politics around business has changed, how policy around business has changed.
So I think you're right, and I think also thinking back to when it was, one of the big challenges for businesses is, as much as we weren't sure what was going to happen with the economy, they weren't sure either how hard hit their businesses would be. And I think a really good example of that is IKEA, actually. So when in the initial lockdown, they sort of went from having a viable, very good business to having no revenue coming in the door. And so they did initially use some of the furlough money, they used some government support, but then as the economy opened up and they were allowed to obviously do online sales again, they then did, had a period of trading where they did very well. And so they realized that actually they didn't need, that support had been critical when they weren't sure what was going to happen beyond that time period. And so they returned their furlough money and their job retention scheme money. And so and we've seen various businesses take that approach. And the other area has been around some of the business rates relief, which went across retail, hospitality and leisure, but obviously some of the essential retailers who had to invest a lot actually to make their premises COVID secure. So they definitely bore more costs, but actually they did have a challenges around some of their sales, but obviously food sales did really well. So over a period of time, many of those retailers have repaid that business rates relief. So I think businesses have always been mindful only to sort of take what they need, but the challenge for many of them is they had that huge period of uncertainty where they just didn't know what their business would look like. And I think actually it's been interesting now, even just reflecting on some of the, how the budget has sort of gone down with business. And I think there's a general sense that actually the Chancellor's taken the right approach, that we've seen some of the important short-term support carrying on. I think everyone recognises we need that job retention scheme to continue till the end of June and to taper thereafter. But I think businesses themselves, even those who are still using it, particularly in the aviation sector, where they're looking at handfuls of passengers at the moment relative to normal volumes, where they might have hundreds of thousands of people going through their airports every day, they recognize that support does need to taper away as restrictions are lifted. So I think businesses do see that we need to taper away that support. And I think where there are continuing concerns tends to be about the gap. So it's very hard to reach some of the businesses in supply chain. So we talk a lot about the cafes, the restaurants, the pubs, the hotels. But if you're making pizzas that are only sold in hotels, then you effectively have no revenue coming in the door. And yet there hasn't been targeted support for your business. So those tend to be where the remaining gaps are, but you know, I think there's a recognition we've had the right amount of support, and now the next phase is about tapering around that support and really thinking about that medium term and creating jobs and business investment over the medium term.
Thank you, Ray. Matthew, can I, that point about supply chains, I mean, my goodness, isn't it? That's one of the features of the year, is that, you know, this realization of the extent to which we're reliant on supply chains and the difficulty that government has had in trying to identify those supply chains and provide support both at a local and a national level. But can you, you know, in this last 10 minutes, it'd be really helpful just to sort of really look forward. I'd love you to pick up on the point that Deb Oxley made right at the start and that Rain picked up on, which is, okay, what should we be beginning to think about, plan for in terms of the second half, certainly the last quarter of the year? Because I think one of the criticisms that's made of us all in different ways is we've struggled to look beyond the day-to-day, even the next fortnight. So how do we begin to think about things towards the end of the year? And can you also just pick up on, Matthew, the move away from horizontal support, from rules that cover all parts of the economy, to support that's going to be needed and rules that are going to be needed for particular sectors of the economy?
Yeah, thanks, James. Well, maybe to start with that almost impossible question, what's going to happen in the second half of the year, but to have a crack at that sort of thing. I mean, so firstly, let's just assume for a moment that the sort of government roadmap as sort of mapped out holds essentially, and we don't have major sort of shocks or setbacks. So fingers crossed on that. I mean, I guess firstly, in terms of this desire for people to get back and so on, Rain talked about her Nike swoosh earlier on. And I almost wonder on this, there might be a bit of an upside down Nike swoosh in some respects, because you'll have a sort of desire to, everyone will want to dash back and get back sort of thing, because it's new and it's novel and we've not been able to do those kind of things, but including going to the office and so on. And then that might normalize a little bit through the autumn. So as people sort of settle down into a new rhythm and that hybrid working and so on that Jenny talked about. So I think that might be the thing that happens in terms of human behavior. Second thought for me would actually be Rain's point about differentiating between structural and cyclical impacts. And I think in particular there, some of the structural impacts we'll see around what's going to happen in retail, the big push to online, which I think many people are going to stick, and the ramifications that has for the sort of future in towns and cities and so on. So that will be something that I think will play through, continuing online, and that will force a bit of a rethinking about city centres and so on. We heard over the weekend, I was reading a piece about Ipswich pitching to be the sort of UK's first 15-minute town and things like that. So I suspect we'll see some of that thinking start to go on. Another thought for me would be, I think lots of businesses, as well as us as employees and individuals, will be grappling with quite a bit of relearning over the autumn, actually, as we get back into the sort of normal course of events, as well as some of those hybrid working measures. Jenny mentioned the guide that we produced. Many of the issues there are around, you know, how do you train managers and leaders to sort of fairly assess people, whether they're working remotely or in person. It's about how you're going to sort of develop a new skill in leading and chairing hybrid meetings, for example. You know, it's relatively easy if we're all offline in the remote world, or if we're all together in a room, but doing the two. So I think there'll be quite a lot of relearning for businesses and individuals to do over the autumn. And then I think my final thoughts, James, would be, how do we get ready for that fourth quarter? I would say, imagine both what's going to continue to need to be in place, Rain's point, and I think testing is probably one of the last things that we'll withdraw, because we need to be able to stay on top of any flare-ups and so on, so that we don't return to the sort of full lockdown state. So I think people should be planning around that being around for some time to come. And then the final thought for me would be around resilience. You know, we're all, it's a classic sort of hope for the best but plan for the worst. I think everybody should have an eye to, look, how do we stay resilient? Hopefully not anything of this scale, but that eye and attention on well-being, workplace security and safety, resilience to pandemics and so on. I think that is something that people should take with them in their thoughts through to the autumn and beyond.
Thanks, Matthew. Rain, can I ask you one thing, which is a future-facing question too? I think a lot of businesses are now beginning to wrap their heads around this debate about inflation and the question around future interest rates. It's very hard to read, and I just wonder what your best thinking is on what happens now in terms of inflation and what the knock-on implications are for interest rates?
Yeah, so I think I'd sort of start as well. You know, you were saying you were looking for some sort of rays of optimism from all of us, and actually, I think in our regional councils and some of our committees that we've seen over the last couple of weeks, we've been asking businesses, you know, obviously their reactions to the budget, both in terms of the short term and the long term, but how is their business doing? What are their views for the year ahead? And actually there has been a sense of optimism. I'm not, you know, that isn't to say for some businesses it's still really tough, but those tend to be more concentrated in certain sectors. And I think there's definitely a sense that businesses, you know, many businesses have adapted and they are seeing growth opportunities out there. I think the challenges around inflation are, you know, at the moment when you look at what the sort of Bank of England have put forward, there's still, you know, some scope for the economy to grow before we hit some of those capacity constraints. But actually, a former colleague of mine, Karen Ward, really articulated it well, I think, when I heard her on the radio this morning, when she was saying the real challenge, right, is for us to make sure we don't see kind of inflation take off. We need a supply, which is why we've been sort of working on supporting businesses through this to match that kind of increase in demand. I think we will see as restrictions lift, and we're all going to be desperate to get into our local restaurant. I certainly am struggling to get an appointment with my hairdresser, even when I'm booking several weeks, if not months ahead. So we know there's going to be a lot of pent up demand for some of those services as they reopen. Now that's a real challenge for the Bank of England. I think on terms of the outlook for interest rates, I think there's a few things we really have to bear in mind. We are seeing structurally low real interest rates, and that is something that has been happening for decades. It's about an aging population. There are global factors that are driving that. So I think if people have in their heads a sort of anchor in terms of interest rates like we saw in the 80s, I think those are misplaced now because we're in a very different structural world. Then the second question is, as I said, we will see increased demand, but our sense is as things open up, the supply will come back. So actually, you know, the economists, you fall into two camps. Are you more worried about higher unemployment and the risk of sort of business failures, or are you more worried about inflation? And for me, I'm more worried about the issues around scarring of higher unemployment and some of those, and actually those sort of issues than I am in the near term around inflation. I think if we do start to see inflation pick up, I do think the Bank of England do have time to act. But for me, I still think we'll see interest rates very low for a longer period of time.
Rain, that's very helpful. Jennifer, in 1 minute, can I just ask you to pick up on that point, and particularly around policy on skills? Because if you take Rain's point, presumably that's where government attention goes.
Yeah, I think the key thing on skills is maybe alluding to what Rain mentioned earlier, is that we have long had chronic shortage of skills, particularly around reskilling and adult education. That's not new, but the COVID situation has massively accelerated some of the structural issues in adult education and retraining. So she was talking about the move to digital, for example, move to more service-based economy, for example. The skills training landscape, we had pre-pandemic done some research which said that by 2030, 9 out of 10 adults would need to retrain. And of course, that situation has just accelerated. And I think the key thing that the government will be looking to is the incentives that it can provide businesses to invest, particularly for SMEs. And also the other thing which I think the policy landscape needs to look at is improving the training provision, or improving training provision for adults especially, because at the moment it's very, very geared towards younger people.
Jenny, thank you very much. And Rain, thank you too. Matthew, the final word to you. I'm interested to know, are you picking up any change in tone, in confidence? Rain mentioned this in terms of regional councils, but as the vaccines roll out, are you seeing anything fundamentally changing in what you perceive as business confidence?
Yeah, James, I mean, I think generally against that backdrop, you would expect to see a sort of tick up. I would say, you know, the reality is it still differs very much depending on what nature of business you are. You know, there are some still either hugely frustrated that they can't get going and they wish they were sooner in the government's roadmap. If you're in sort of hospitality or live events, some of the non-essential retail, you're chomping at the bit wanting to go, but are held back. And whilst you're in that state, such as the likes of aviation, it's still almost a sort of 24 hours hand-to-mouth existence point of view. But I think overall, we're seeing more and more firms wanting to plan for the future and also talk about the long term as well. So they're tipping over into that forward look and hoping with a bit more optimism.
Okay, well, Matthew, Phil, thank you very much. Jenny Beckwith, Ray Newton-Smith, thank you very much. A really fascinating conversation. Actually kicks us into the week very nicely. I hope everyone has a very good week. CBI at 10 back on Wednesday. I know that Julian Richer and among others are joining us. So look forward to seeing you then. Have a very good week. Thanks so much.